The twin sons of Tatooine rose together every morning, indifferent to the lives scattered across their burning sands. They did not care who lived in a moisture, farmer's modest homestead, or who slept in the gutted husk of a derelict transport on the edge of Mos Espa. They simply rose, and burned, and set, and rose again, the same relentless rhythm that had governed this desert world since before the Republic ever drew its borders across the galaxy. But on one particular morning, beneath those same indifferent suns, a boy named Daniel would wake to find that the world he knew had ended. The Skywalker farm, no relation to the moisture farmers of local legend, just another homestead among hundreds dotting the wastes outside. Mos Espa had belonged to the same family for 2 generations. Daniel's father, Baron, had wrestled water from dry ground with vaporators he repaired himself, patched together from parts too old for anyone else to want. His mother, Sella, kept the books, traded excess condensation to nearby settlements, and taught Daniel his letters from a cracked datapad that had outlived 3 owners before her. It was not a wealthy life, but it was theirs. Then came the blight. It moved through the settlement's water table, like a whisper before anyone understood what it was: a bacterial contamination in the deep aquifers that turned clean water sour and then deadly within the space of a season. Baron fell first, his lungs filling with something the local healer had no name for. Sella followed less than 4 months later, her body too worn from grief and overworked to fight what the illness had started. Daniel, not yet 10 years old, stood at 2 graves marked only with scavenged transponder plates, and understood, with the flat clarity that only children possess, that he was now entirely alone. His father's cousins arrived before the dust had settled on the burial mounds. They came with a bantha-drawn cart and false, practiced sympathy, speaking softly of family duty and blood obligation. Within a week, the vaporators were sold to a passing Jawa sandcrawler for a fraction of their worth. The homestead's modest herd of dewbacks went to a HUD-affiliated trader in Mos Eisley. The land itself, worthless without water rights, which somehow transferred quietly into the cousins' names, was leased out to a moisture syndicate that never once acknowledged Daniel existed. Everything his parents had built, sweated over, and loved was liquidated within a season, and none of the proceeds touched Daniel's hands. He was given a corner of an old storage hut behind his cousin's new, larger dwelling, barely enough room to lie flat, a thin mat over packed sand, and a door that didn't fully close against the night chill. He was not called family. He was called useful. Every morning before the twin sons crested the dunes, Daniel was sent to haul water from the settlement's shared condenser 3 kilometers out, his small frame straining under containers meant for grown laborers. He cut power cell scrap for trade, scrubbed vaporator intake filters until his fingers bled from the abrasive dust, and worked borrowed fields that had once, briefly, belonged to his own family. His cousins' children wore clean tunics and rode a repurposed speeder bike to the settlement's tutoring center. Daniel wore clothes patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible, and he watched the speeder's dust trail disappear, each morning with something that was not quite envy and not quite grief, something with no name. The way his father's illness had had no name. "You should be thankful," his eldest cousin, Trevin, told him once, when Daniel dared ask for a second ration of nutrient paste after a full day's labor. "We didn't have to take you in. We could have left you for the Jawas to sort out." The words landed harder than the desert heat ever could, and Daniel learned quickly that hunger, at least, was honest. It did not pretend to love him first. The other children of the settlement were little kinder. Word had spread, the way it always does in small, isolated places, that Daniel's parents had died of something unnatural, something the local healers still couldn't explain, and in the superstitious hush of the outer rim, unexplained deaths bred unexplainable fear. Some of the settlement's children refused to play near him, murmuring that bad luck clung to orphans like sand to sweat. Others laughed outright when his ragged clothes tore further during work, pointing and jeering as though his poverty were a performance, staged for their entertainment. During the settlement's rare festival nights, when families gathered under strings of glow lamps to share what little abundance the desert allowed, Daniel stood at the edges of the light, watching warmth he was never invited into. wishing with a child's aching simplicity that his parents were still there to claim him. Years passed this way. The desert did not soften. His cousins did not relent. And somewhere in that long, grinding stretch of servitude, something in Daniel refused to break the way everyone around him expected it to. Instead of bitterness, something else began to take root. Quiet, stubborn, and entirely his own. Salvation, when it came, did not arrive on the back of a starship or wrapped in the glow of some grand destiny. It arrived in the form of an old man with grease-stained hands and a workshop that smelled of scorched circuitry and vaporator coolant. His name was Old Renick, a droidsmith who had operated out of the same cramped repair stall on the edge of Mos Espas Market district for longer than most of the settlement's residents had been alive. He fixed what the Jawas couldn't sell and the Hutts didn't care about: battered protocol units, cracked power couplings, moisture vaporators too stubborn to die completely. He kept to himself, trusted no one fully, and had long ago stopped expecting anything good from the people around him. Daniel first crossed his path by accident, sent to trade scrap metal for credits his cousins would inevitably pocket. While Renick haggled over the weight of a bent chassis panel, Daniel's eyes had drifted to a dead astromech slumped in the corner of the stall, its dome cracked, one photoreceptor dark, wiring spilling from its casing like exposed nerves. Without thinking, without being asked, Daniel had crouched beside it and begun, quietly, methodically, to trace the damage with small, careful fingers. "You know what you're looking at, boy?" Renick had asked, not unkindly, more curious than anything. Daniel had shrugged. The power couplings fused. Somebody rerouted the primary line wrong, and it fed back into the motivator. He'd pointed without hesitation to a scorched relay half-hidden beneath a tangle of wire. "This is why." Renick had said nothing for a long moment. Then he had asked Daniel to come back the next day. What began as curiosity became routine, and what began as routine became the only good thing in Daniel's life. After his cousin's chores were done, the water hauled, the fields worked, the scraps sorted, Daniel would slip away in the deepening dusk to Renick's stall, where the old droidsmith taught him without ceremony or softness, the way one teaches a trade to someone who might actually need it to survive. Wiring diagrams, power cell chemistry, the stubborn, particular logic of astromech processors. So different from the protocol units, more predictable circuitry. Daniel absorbed it the way the desert absorbed water, completely, and without waste. He was, Renick admitted grudgingly after the first year, better with his hands than anyone the old man had trained in 3 decades of teaching. It was not an easy education. Renick had little patience for excuses and less for self-pity. And more than once Daniel returned to his corner of the storage hut with burns on his fingers from a coupling handled wrong, or bruised knuckles from a stubborn housing panel that had fought back. But for the first time since his parents' graves had been marked, Daniel felt something other than grief and obligation. He felt purpose. By the time he was 14, Daniel could strip and rebuild a moisture vaporator faster than men twice his age, could coax function out of astromech units that even Renick had written off as scrap, and had begun, quietly, without his cousin's knowledge, since anything he built belonged to them by unspoken law, designing small modifications of his own, a power regulator that ran cooler than the standard Corellian model, a filtration adapter that stretched a vaporator's output by nearly a fifth. Nothing revolutionary, but nothing anyone else on this stretch of the Dune Sea had thought to try, either. Word of the boy's talent moved slowly through Mos Espas Market District, the way anything true eventually does in a place built on rumor and desperation. Pod racing pit crews began asking after him when their engines ran rough. A moisture farmer 3 settlements over sent word through a trader, asking if the junk boy from Renick's stall might look at a vaporator array that 3 professional technicians had already failed to fix. Daniel fixed it in an afternoon, refusing payment because his cousins would only claim it. And Renick, watching from the doorway of his stall, said nothing. But the old man's silence carried something that felt, for the first time in years, like pride. It was during this quiet, unglamorous stretch of Daniel's life, hauling water by morning, laboring in borrowed fields by midday, learning the language of circuits and coolant lines by night, that the galaxy beyond Tatooine's twin suns continued its slow drift toward war. The Republic's Senate debated trade regulations that meant nothing to a boy in a desert backwater. The Jedi Order maintained its watch over a peace that had not yet cracked. None of it touched Mos Espa. None of it touched Daniel. Not yet. But 4 years after that first cracked astromech, on a day distinguished by nothing except the ordinary brutality of Tatooine's heat, a modest Republic cargo hauler would set down in Mos Espa's docking bay for routine repairs, piloted by a trader with a broken navicomputer, an eye for undervalued talent, and no idea that the boy sent to fix his ship would one day reshape an entire corner of the galaxy's shipping industry. Rennick would recommend Daniel for the job without a second thought, and everything would begin to change. The cargo hauler was called the Wandering Prophet, a boxy, unglamorous freighter with more patch welds than original hull plating, and its pilot was a Corellian trader named Hask Doran, a man whose weathered face suggested decades spent navigating both hyperspace lanes and the far more treacherous currents of outer rim commerce. His navicomputer had failed somewhere past the junction, forcing an unscheduled stop in Mos Espa, and his usual contact for parts had retired the previous season. Frustrated, low on credits, and unwilling to trust HUD-affiliated repair crews who were known to inflate prices for stranded travelers, Hask had asked around the market district for someone reliable. Every trader he spoke to gave him the same answer: go to Rennick's stall and ask for the boy. Daniel was 16 when he climbed into the Wandering Prophet's cramped navigation bay, tools slung over one shoulder, and found a navicomputer core that 3 previous technicians, each charging exorbitant HUT territory rates, had failed to properly diagnose. He worked in silence for the better part of 6 hours, ignoring Hask's occasional attempts at conversation, tracing the fault not just to the obvious burned relay the other technicians had replaced twice already, but to a deeper flaw in the cooling regulator that had been causing the relay to fail. In the first place, he fixed both. He also, without being asked, recalibrated the ship's aging hyperdrive motivator, shaving nearly 8% off its fuel consumption through an adjustment he'd developed himself, tinkering with Rennick's discarded scrap. Hask Doran sat in the pilot's chair afterward for a long moment, staring at the diagnostic readout, and then at the teenage boy wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had clearly seen better decades. You built this modification yourself? Hask asked. Wasn't hard, Daniel said. Just wasteful, the way it was running before. Kid, half the certified techs on Corellia couldn't tell you why that's wasteful, let alone fix it. Hask studied him with new interest. How much do I owe you? Daniel hesitated. Whatever he named, his cousins would claim as their own. That was the arrangement, unspoken but absolute, that had governed every credit he'd ever earned since his parents' deaths. He named a modest figure, low enough that it wouldn't draw scrutiny, and turned to leave. Hask stopped him with a question that would alter the entire shape of Daniel's life. Where do you go after this? Back to whatever hole you crawled out of, fixing junk for scraps. The bluntness of it stung, but there was no cruelty in Hask's voice, only the plain assessment of a man who dealt in value and had just watched a great deal of it walk into his ship wearing rags. Daniel said nothing, which was answer enough. I've got a standing contract with a shipyard on Corellia, Hask continued. They're always looking for good hands, real good hands, not just certified ones. I could put in a word. Passage off this rock. Work that actually pays what it's worth. Room and board while you learn the trade proper. He paused. No family holding you back. Daniel's throat tightened around the truth of it, that he had no family left to hold him anywhere. Only people who had claimed his family's name without earning any right to it. No, he said. Nothing holding me back. That evening, Daniel returned to Rennick's stall not to work, but to say goodbye. The old droidsmith listened to the offer in silence, weathered face unreadable in the dying light of the twin suns, and then did something Daniel had never seen him do in 4 years of apprenticeship. He smiled, small and genuine. I taught you everything I know 11 months ago, Rennick said. Everything since has been you teaching. Yourself. Go. There's nothing here for a mind like yours except sand and people too small to see what you're worth. He pressed a worn toolkit into Daniel's hands, his own, the one he'd carried since before Daniel was born, and refused to hear any argument against it. Daniel did not return to his cousin's hut that night to gather belongings. There was nothing there that belonged to him, and nothing he wished to carry forward except the scars, the lessons, and the quiet, burning determination that 4 years of Rennick's tutelage had sharpened into something resembling purpose. He left a single message, relayed through a settlement trader the following morning, informing his relatives that he would not be returning, and that they were welcome to whatever remained of a life they had never truly let him claim as his own. The wandering prophet left Tatooine's atmosphere at dawn, twin suns burning gold and white against a sky Daniel had never seen from above. He pressed his face to the viewport as the desert world shrank behind them, the only home he had ever known. The sight of both his family's grave and his own quiet reinvention, and felt, for the first time in 6 years, something dangerously close to hope. He did not yet know that a galaxy already sliding toward war awaited him on the other side of that jump to hyperspace, or that the skills he carried in a borrowed toolkit would one day make him wealthier and more influential than the relatives who had once called him worthless. He knew only that Tatooine was behind him, and the stars ahead were his to shape. Corellia was nothing like Tatooine, and the shock of that difference nearly overwhelmed Daniel in his first week planetside, where Mos Espa had been sand and heat and the endless flat horizon of dune country. Corellia's shipyards sprawled across an industrial coastline in towers of scaffolding and permacrete, ringed by orbital docks that fed a constant stream of freighters, cruisers, and half-built hulls into the planet's massive construction base. The air smelled of ionized metal and promethium exhaust, instead of dry heat and vaporator coolant. The noise never stopped, the clang of assembly droids, the whine of plasma cutters, the distant thunder of ships breaking atmosphere. For a boy raised in the hush of the desert, was almost too much to process. Hask Doran made good on his word, delivering Daniel to the offices of Trellham Fabrication Yards, a mid-tier shipbuilding concern that supplied parts and repair services to independent haulers, minor Republic contracts, and the occasional HUD-affiliated freighter too proud to admit where its money came from. Daniel started at the bottom, exactly as Hask had promised, cleaning conduit housings, sorting salvaged components, running errands for technicians who barely acknowledged his presence. It was not glamorous. It was, Daniel reflected during his first exhausted nights in a shared workers' dormitory, not entirely unlike the labor his cousins had demanded of him, except here. At the end of each week, the credits that landed in his account were his own. That single fact changed everything. For the first time in his life, Daniel could choose what to do with what he earned, and what he chose, almost without exception, was to reinvest it in himself. While the other junior workers spent their modest wages on drink, gambling, and the fleeting comforts of a shipyard town built to separate laborers from their credits, Daniel lived with the same discipline that had kept him alive under his cousins. Cruelty, spare, careful, deliberate. He rented the cheapest bunk available. He ate the plainest rations. And every spare credit went toward two things: technical manuals that Trellham's senior engineers didn't bother reading anymore, and second-hand tools that let him practice modifications on his own time. In the corner of a maintenance bay, the night shift supervisor let him use in exchange for keeping the astromech fleet running smoothly. Within 6 months, Daniel had been noticed, not by executives, who rarely looked past a junior technician's work orders, but by Foreman Ussa Barn, a stocky, no-nonsense supervisor who had spent 30 years watching young workers either burn out or blend into the background. Daniel did neither. He asked questions the senior engineers found irritating, precisely because they were good questions. He fixed problems on his own initiative that weren't technically his responsibility. And when a contracted hyperdrive shipment arrived with a batch of faulty motivators that threatened to delay an entire Republic supply contract, it was Daniel, 17 years old, technically still a junior sorter, who identified the manufacturing flaw that Trellham's own quality inspectors had missed. Ussa promoted him to the assembly floor that same week, over the quiet objections of engineers, who resented being shown up by a teenager from an outer rim backwater. It was on the assembly floor that Daniel's real education began, not in the mechanics of starship components, which he had already mastered far beyond what his age suggested, but in the far more complicated mechanics of business, contracts, and the delicate politics of an industry built on reputation as much as raw skill. He watched how Trellham negotiated with Republic procurement officers, how pricing shifted depending on which client desperately needed a repair versus which client could afford to walk away. He watched, too, how the yard's owners took credit for innovations that junior workers like himself had actually developed, filing patents under corporate names while the engineers who'd solved the problems received nothing beyond their standard wage. That injustice, small as it seemed against the vast unfairness Daniel had already survived, lodged itself somewhere deep and did not let go. He began, quietly, to keep records of his own, sketches of modifications, notes on inefficiencies he spotted across the yard, ideas for components that didn't yet exist but probably should. He shared none of it with Trellham's engineers. He had learned, in his cousin's hut and in this shipyard alike, exactly what happened to value when it passed through hands that hadn't earned it. By his second year on Corellia, Daniel had saved enough credits to rent a small workspace of his own on the edge of the shipyard district, barely more than a converted storage unit, cluttered with second-hand tools and cannibalized parts, but entirely his. He worked there after his shifts ended, sometimes until the early hours of the morning, refining a design he'd been developing in secret, a modular power regulator, based loosely on the modification he'd first built for Hask, Doran's aging freighter, but scaled and re-engineered to work across a far wider range of ship classes. He did not yet know it would become the foundation of everything he built afterward. He knew only that it worked better than anything Trellham currently sold, that no one else had thought to build it quite this way, and that for the first time since his parents' deaths, he held something in his hands that was entirely, undeniably his own. The galaxy beyond Corellia's shipyards continued its slow drift toward crisis. Separatist rhetoric growing louder in the Senate, trade routes tightening, whispers of war spreading through the same cantinas where shipyard workers drank away their wages. Daniel paid it little attention. He was too busy building the first true foundation of an empire no one, least of all himself, yet understood he was capable of constructing. The modular power regulator that Daniel unveiled to Foreman Ussabarn on a quiet evening shift changed the trajectory of his life more decisively than anything since the day Hask, Doran's freighter, had first landed in Mos Espa. It was, in its essence, a deceptively simple innovation, a regulator housing that could be reconfigured on the fly to match power distribution across radically different ship classes, freighters, shuttles, even small Republic patrol craft, without the costly, time-consuming rewiring that every yard on Corellia currently treated as unavoidable. Where Trellham's engineers built each regulator custom to a specific hull, Daniel's design adapted itself. It meant faster repairs, cheaper retrofits, and a margin of efficiency that no competing yard in the sector could currently match. Ussa turned the prototype over in his weathered hands for a long time, saying nothing, and Daniel felt the old, familiar dread rise in his chest, the fear that this, too, would be claimed by someone else's name, filed under a patent that erased him entirely, the way every other innovation on this assembly floor eventually was. "This is yours," Ussa asked finally. "Built on your own time, your own credits?" "Every part of it," Daniel said. Ussa set the regulator down carefully, as though it were something far more fragile than Durasteel and coiled power conduit. "Then it stays yours, boy. I've watched this yard eat good ideas from good workers for 30 years, and I'll not be part of it happening to you." He paused. "But you'll need more than a good design to keep it that way. You'll need a lawyer, a patent filing, and enough credits to defend it if Trellham decides they want it anyway." It was not encouragement so much as a warning, and Daniel absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, without complaint, already calculating his next move. He spent the following months living a double life. By day, he remained a diligent, unremarkable assembly technician, careful never to let his superiors glimpse the scope of what he was building on the side. By night, he refined the regulator design further, sought out a modest, independent patent attorney, willing to work for a percentage rather than an upfront fee he couldn't afford, and began, tentatively, reaching out to smaller independent shipyards and freight operators across the sector, men and women like Hask Doran, who valued reliability over prestige and were often ignored by larger yards. too busy courting lucrative Republic contracts. His first sale was to Hask himself, who bought 2 units without hesitation and, more valuably, spread word of them across the loose network of independent traders who moved cargo through Corellia's outer docks. His second sale came from that same network, a freight cooperative operating out of Duro, desperate for equipment that didn't require the extensive maintenance downtime their current regulators demanded. By the end of that year, Daniel had sold 47 units, entirely through word of mouth, entirely outside Trellham's knowledge, and had saved enough to file the patent formally under a name that was entirely legally his own, Rinnick Fabrication, a small, private tribute to the old droidsmith who had taught a grieving, hungry boy that his hands were worth something. It could not remain secret forever. A rival technician, resentful of Daniel's quiet promotions and increasingly aware of the side business generating quiet buzz among independent traders, reported the arrangement to Trellham's ownership, framing it as theft of proprietary knowledge developed on company time. Daniel was summoned before Trellham's senior partners, 3 men who had built their fortune on exactly the kind of quiet appropriation Daniel had spent 2 years carefully avoiding. They accused him, in cold corporate language, of stealing intellectual property that belonged to the yard by virtue of his employment. It would have been easy, in that moment, to feel the old helplessness return, the same voice that had once told him he was just an orphan, undeserving of what little he had. Instead, Daniel felt something colder and steadier settle into place. He produced, without hesitation, his own patent filing, dated and notarized months before the regulator had ever touched Trellham's assembly floor, alongside detailed logs, proving every hour of development had occurred on his own time, using his own purchased materials. In a workspace he rented independently, the partner's lawyer confirmed, with visible irritation, that the filing was airtight. Trellham's senior partners, unable to claim the design, pivoted instead to an offer, a licensing agreement, generous by the standards they normally extended to junior technicians, granting the yard exclusive regional rights to manufacture Daniel's regulator in exchange for a percentage of every unit sold, plus a substantial signing bonus. Daniel, 18 years old and holding more leverage in that boardroom than anyone in it had expected, countered instead for a non-exclusive licensing arrangement, a seat as technical consultant rather than assembly line labor, and the right to continue independent sales through his own growing network. They agreed. They had little choice. That evening, standing alone in the small rented workspace that had incubated the first true asset of what would eventually become an empire, Daniel allowed himself, for the first time since his parents' graves had been marked beneath Tatooine's twin sons, something that felt less like grim survival and more like triumph. The licensing agreement with Trellham Fabrication Yards was, in hindsight, less an ending than a beginning, the first domino in a chain of decisions that would carry Daniel from a rented storage unit on the edge of Corellia's shipyard district to something far larger than either he or old Rinnick could have imagined during those long evenings spent hunched over a dead Astromech's cracked dome. Daniel used the signing bonus not to improve his own modest living conditions, which remained deliberately spare, but to formally establish Rinnick Fabrication as an independent concern, a small office, a handful of trusted contract workers, poached quietly from Trellham's own resentful, underpaid labor pool, and a manufacturing arrangement with a secondary yard willing to produce his regulators at scale in exchange for a modest royalty. He was 19 when he signed his first sector-wide distribution contract, 20 when Rinnick Fabrication outgrew its original office twice over, and 21 when the modular regulator, now in its third refined iteration, became a standard fixture aboard independent freighters across 4 sectors of Republic space. Success, Daniel discovered, bred its own momentum, where he had once struggled to secure a single meeting with skeptical shipyard foremen. He now fielded unsolicited proposals from engineers eager to work under him, investors hoping to buy into whatever he built next, and, with growing frequency, representatives of considerably larger interests who had taken notice of a self-made prodigy quietly reshaping the economics of small freighter maintenance. He expanded deliberately, never recklessly, carrying forward the same discipline that had once meant the difference between a full stomach and an empty one. Where Rinnick fabrication had begun with a single product, it grew, over the following 4 years, into a modest conglomerate of interconnected concerns. A components manufacturing division, a Starship retrofit service catering to independent traders, underserved by larger yards, and eventually a small shipbuilding operation of its own, constructing modest, reliable freighters, designed specifically for operators who could never afford the premium vessels, favored by wealthier clients. It was during this period of steady, unglamorous expansion that Daniel first crossed paths with the galaxy's larger, more dangerous currents that had, until now, remained distant rumors, carried through cantina gossip and holonet broadcasts he rarely had time to watch. A HUD-affiliated shipping concern, recognizing the value of Daniel's efficient, reliable freighters for their own less-than-legal cargo operations, approached him directly with an offer, far more lucrative than anything his legitimate contracts provided: exclusive manufacturing rights in exchange for turning a convenient blind eye toward what, precisely, his ships would ultimately carry. Daniel refused, calmly and without apparent fear, despite Foreman Ussabarn's private warning that such refusals were not always survivable when HUD interests were involved. "I built this out of nothing, because I refused to let people take what wasn't theirs," Daniel told the HUD representative, a sharp-eyed Twi'lek negotiator named Vesa Rowe. In a meeting Daniel insisted on holding in his own modest office rather than neutral ground. "I'm not interested in helping anyone else do the same to someone weaker than them." Vesa Rowe had studied him for a long moment, something between irritation and grudging respect crossing her features, before informing him that her employer rarely accepted refusal gracefully. Daniel had simply nodded, unshaken, and the meeting ended without threat or violence, though. Daniel doubled his security arrangements in the weeks that followed, a quiet acknowledgement that principle, however important, did not make him invulnerable. Almost simultaneously, a second approach arrived, this one considerably more legitimate and considerably more consequential. A procurement officer from the Galactic Republic's Corellian Sector Office, aware of Rinnick Fabrication's reputation for reliable, cost-efficient components, inquired whether Daniel's operation might be interested in a modest supply contract supporting Republic logistics vessels. Nothing glamorous, nothing tied to the growing military buildup that increasingly dominated Senate debate, but steady, honorable work that would place Rinnick Fabrication's components aboard officially sanctioned Republic craft for the first time. Daniel accepted without hesitation. It was not politics that drew him. He harbored no particular loyalty to the Republic, having grown up in a stretch of the Outer Rim where the Republic's presence had never once extended far enough to matter. But the promise of stable, honest work, entirely divorced from the compromises Vesa Rowe's employer had offered, appealed to something fundamental in how Daniel had chosen to build his life. By the time he turned 23, Rinnick Fabrication had grown from a converted storage unit into a recognized name across half a dozen outer and mid-rim sectors, employing several hundred workers, many of them, deliberately, hired from backgrounds not unlike his own: orphans, indentured laborers who had bought out their contracts, refugees from worlds too poor or too troubled for larger corporations to bother recruiting from. He had built, without quite realizing the scale of what he'd accomplished, something that resembled less a company and more a quiet philosophy given industrial form, proof, assembled piece by piece from scrap metal and stubborn will, that the desperate, discarded, and disregarded could build something the galaxy would eventually be forced to respect. He had not yet returned to Tatooine. He had not yet faced the relatives who had once called him worthless, or the settlement that had watched him suffer without intervening. But as Rinnick Fabrication's reach continued to grow, and as whispers of war grew louder across the Republic's fraying edges, that reckoning was drawing steadily, inevitably closer. War came to the galaxy the way Daniel's own tragedies had once come to him, suddenly, and then all at once, leaving no corner of the Republic untouched. The Clone Wars erupted across the holonet in a storm of separatist droid armies and newly revealed clone legions. The Jedi Order thrust from peacekeepers into generals almost overnight. For most of the galaxy, It was a rupture that reshaped everything. For Daniel, 23 years old and standing at the head of a components empire he had built from a dead astromech and his stubborn refusal to stay broken. It was both catastrophe and opportunity, and he understood, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had guided him since Rennick's stall, that surviving the war intact would require navigating both with equal care. Republic military. Logistics officers descended on Corellia's shipyards within weeks of the war's outbreak, desperate to secure reliable component suppliers as separatist blockades threatened established supply chains across the outer rim. Rennick Fabrication, with its reputation for efficient, adaptable designs and its existing Republic contract, found itself suddenly courted by military procurement in a manner that dwarfed anything Daniel had negotiated before. The offers were staggering. Exclusive military contracts worth more in a single fiscal cycle than his entire company had earned in its first 5 years combined. Daniel accepted a portion of them, carefully, deliberately, and always on terms that preserved his independence. He supplied power regulators and retrofit components for Republic logistics vessels, medical frigates, and supply freighters, the unglamorous backbone of any war effort. Far from the glory of Jedi generals and clone legions, but no less essential. He refused, however, every request to redirect his manufacturing entirely toward military production, refused every attempt by ambitious Republic officers to fold Rennick Fabrication into the war machine as a wholly owned military contractor. "I didn't build this to make weapons," he told one particularly persistent Republic colonel, a stern woman named Yeska Torn who had grown frustrated with his refusals. "I'll keep your logistics ships running. I won't stop supplying independent traders and civilian operators. Just because the Senate's decided. Everyone needs to pick a side." It was a dangerous position to hold, and Daniel knew it. Separatist sympathizers within the sector viewed his Republic contracts with open hostility, while certain Republic officials viewed his continued civilian dealings, including, quietly, his ongoing refusal to entirely sever ties with independent traders who sometimes operated in legally gray territory, as suspiciously divided loyalty. He walked a narrow line, and more than once, that line nearly cost him everything. The most serious threat came not from separatist agents or disgruntled Republic officers, but from Vesa Ro's employer, the Hutt shipping concern Daniel had refused years earlier. With the war disrupting established smuggling routes and driving up demand for reliable, unmarked freighters, the Hutt cartel renewed its interest in Rennick Fabrications shipbuilding division, this time with considerably less patience for refusal. A sabotage attempt on one of Daniel's secondary manufacturing facilities on the outskirts of Corellia's shipyard district left 3 workers injured and nearly destroyed. 2 years of prototype development on a next-generation freighter design Daniel had been quietly perfecting. He responded not with retaliation, which his security consultants urged, but with a calculated demonstration of resolve. He publicly announced a substantial reward for information leading to the saboteurs' identification, funded an expanded security division staffed largely by former Republic clone troopers seeking work beyond military service, and, in a move that surprised even his closest advisors, personally visited every injured worker in Corellia's medical facilities, ensuring their treatment and recovery came entirely at company expense. The gesture accomplished what threats and lawyers could not. Word spread quickly through the sectors, labor networks that Rennick Fabrication's founder had not forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable, had not insulated himself from the workers who built his fortune. Loyalty, already considerable among his largely orphaned and formerly indentured workforce, deepened into something closer to devotion. When HUD agents attempted a second, more direct approach weeks later, they found Daniel's facilities guarded not merely by hired security, but by workers themselves, unwilling to see their livelihoods threatened again. The Hutt cartel, recognizing a battle not worth the cost, quietly withdrew its interest. By the second year of the war, Rennick Fabrication had grown into something considerably larger than Daniel had ever intended. When he'd first sketched a modular regulator design in a rented storage unit, an operation spanning multiple star systems, employing thousands, supplying both Republic logistics and independent civilian traders with equal reliability, all while carefully avoiding the moral compromises that wars so often demanded. Of those who profited from it, Daniel was 25 years old, wealthy beyond anything his childhood self could have imagined, and increasingly aware that the growing scale of his success had placed him within reach of decisions that would soon force him to confront the place and the people he had left behind on Tatooine 6 years earlier. The war showed no signs of ending, but something else, something older and more personal than galactic politics, had begun quietly pulling at Daniel's attention. Reports filtering through his trade networks of a bonded labor crisis, worsening across the Outer Rim as separatist blockades disrupted supply lines, driving desperate settlements deeper into the same predatory arrangements that had once stolen his own childhood. Tatooine, his reports indicated, was suffering worse than most. The reports arrived through Daniel's trade network in fragments. At first, a supplier mentioning delayed shipments out of Mos Espa, a logistics officer noting that Tatooine's already thin water infrastructure had collapsed, further under wartime strain. A former settlement acquaintance tracked down through a trader's idle gossip, describing conditions that made Daniel's own childhood suffering sound almost mild by comparison. The war had not touched Tatooine directly. No battles were fought in its deserts. No separatist fleets contested its orbit, but its economy, already precarious, had been strangled by disrupted trade routes and a sudden influx of desperate refugees, fleeing more contested Outer Rim worlds. HUD-affiliated moneylenders, sensing opportunity in the crisis, had expanded their predatory bonded labor practices aggressively, ensnaring entire families in debt arrangements that mirrored, with uncomfortable precision, the arrangement Daniel's own relatives had once forced upon him. He sat with this information for 3 days before making a decision, turning it over with the same careful deliberation he applied to every major choice since Rennick had first pressed a worn toolkit into his hands. Vengeance, he recognized, would have been easy. His wealth and growing influence could have crushed his relatives, could have humiliated the settlement that had watched him suffer without intervening, could have satisfied something old and wounded that still lived, however quietly, beneath everything he'd built. But vengeance, he understood with the same clarity that had guided every decision since his parents' graves, built nothing. It only mirrored the cruelty it claimed to answer. Instead, Daniel initiated something he had been quietly developing for over a year, ever since his company's growth had first made such ambitions feasible. The Rennick Foundation, a charitable and infrastructure arm of his business empire, designed to fund debt relief, infrastructure projects, and vocational training across the Outer Rim's most exploited communities. Tatooine, he decided, would be its first and most personal undertaking. He did not announce his return to Mos Espa in advance. He arrived instead aboard a modest, unmarked transport, one of his own company's freighter designs, deliberately unremarkable, accompanied by a small team of Foundation administrators, engineers, and a hired legal advocate specializing in debt bondage law across HUD-controlled territories. He wanted no fanfare, no procession, no opportunity for his relatives to stage the kind of performative welcome he suspected. Correctly, they would attempt the moment word of his wealth reached them. His first stop was not his cousin's homestead, but Rennick's old stall in Mos Espas Market District. The old droidsmith was frilier than Daniel remembered, his hands trembling now where they had once moved with such steady precision, but his eyes lit with genuine, unguarded joy the moment recognition dawned. "I heard rumors," Rennick said, voice rough with age and something that might have been held back emotion. "Trader talk, about a Corellian company using my name. I told myself it was coincidence." "Foolish old man." "Not foolish," Daniel said. "I meant every letter of it." They spoke for hours in the fading light of the twin suns, Daniel recounting 6 years of struggle and success with the same quiet honesty he'd always shown the old man. Rennick listening, with the particular attention of someone who had recognized potential in a grieving child and never once doubted where it might lead. When Daniel finally raised the subject of the Rennick Foundation's plans for Mos Espa, debt relief for bonded families, infrastructure investment in the settlement's failing water systems, a vocational training center modeled on the very apprenticeship that had once saved Daniel's life. Renick wept without shame, gripping Daniel's hand with what remaining strength his aged fingers possessed. "You were the best thing I ever built," the old man said. "Better than any droid." Word of Daniel's return spread through Mos Espa within a single day, carried by market gossip and trader chatter, with the same speed that had once spread cruel rumors about a cursed orphan boy. By the following morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the modest lodging house where Daniel had taken rooms, settlement residents curious and hopeful, local business owners hoping for contracts, and, inevitably, his cousins. Trevin arrived first, older now, weathered by years that had clearly not been kind to a homestead, built on stolen inheritance and diminishing water rights. He approached with the same false warmth Daniel remembered from childhood, arms already opening for an embrace that assumed forgiveness had been earned simply by the passage of time. "Cousin," Trevin said, voice thick with rehearsed sentiment, "we always knew you'd make something of yourself. We're so proud." Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I remember every day," he said quietly, and something in his tone made the gathering crowd fall silent. "I remember the corner of the hut. I remember being told I should be grateful you didn't leave me for the Jawas. I remember every meal I was denied and every credit of my parents' inheritance you claimed as your own." Trevin's rehearsed warmth faltered, replaced by something closer to fear. "I haven't come to punish you," Daniel continued, and the tension in the crowd shifted, uncertain. "I've come to rebuild what should never have been broken in the first place. Not for you. For everyone here who suffered the way I suffered. And everyone still suffering now." He turned from his stunned cousins without waiting for a response, addressing instead the gathered crowd of settlement residents. The same people who had once watched a starving orphan boy work, borrowed fields without intervening, now watching him return as something none of them had thought possible. "I'm not here for revenge," Daniel said, loud enough now for the entire crowd to hear. "I'm here to make sure no child in this settlement ever has to survive what I survived. That work starts today." The work began within the week, and it began, deliberately, with the most vulnerable rather than the most visible. Daniel's legal advocate, a sharp, unflinching Zabrak woman named Corin Vess, who had spent a decade fighting bonded labor arrangements across Hut territory, moved through Mos Espas settlement records with methodical precision, identifying every family currently trapped in debt bondage contracts, similar to the one that had once bound Daniel's own labor to relatives who held no legitimate claim over him. Many of these arrangements, she confirmed within days, were built on inflated debts, predatory interest structures, and outright fraudulent inheritance seizures, precisely the kind of exploitation that had defined Daniel's own childhood, now playing out across dozens of families throughout the settlement. The Renick Foundation's debt relief fund moved quickly to settle these arrangements, buying out predatory contracts at whatever price the HUD-affiliated moneylenders demanded, then converting them into legitimate employment offers within Daniel's growing local operations, a modest vaporator manufacturing facility, a satellite office of Renick Fabrication's retrofit division, and most ambitiously, the vocational training center Daniel had promised Renick in their emotional reunion. Not everyone welcomed the change gracefully. Bessaro, the same Twi'lek negotiator who had once approached Daniel on behalf of Hut shipping interests, arrived in Mos Espa within the month, this time representing the moneylenders whose predatory contracts Daniel's foundation was systematically dismantling. The meeting, held in the half-constructed shell of what would soon become the vocational training center, carried none of the wary, professional distance of their first encounter years earlier. "You're costing my employer a considerable fortune," Vessa said, studying Daniel with something between irritation and reluctant curiosity. "Debt bondage has been profitable on this world for generations. You understand you're not just freeing families. You're declaring war on an entire economic structure." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Daniel said. "I lived inside that structure for 6 years. I know precisely what it costs the people trapped in it." Vessa studied him for a long moment. The same calculating assessment sheet, once made of a defiant young company founder refusing lucrative but Compromise contracts. My employer could make this considerably more difficult for you, she said, though the threat carried less conviction than it once might have. Your employer could try, Daniel replied, unshaken. But I employ several thousand people across 5 sectors now, including a security division staffed by veterans who've seen considerably worse than HUD intimidation tactics. And I suspect your employer, whoever currently holds that title, understands that a prolonged conflict with a company supplying the Republic's Outer Rim logistics network would draw exactly the kind of attention HUD operations generally prefer to avoid. It was not quite a threat, delivered with none of the aggression such statements typically carried, but the calculation beneath it was unmistakable, and Vessa Rowe recognized it as precisely the kind of quiet, immovable resolve that had defined Daniel's rise from a rented storage unit to a sector-spanning enterprise. She left Mos Espa within the day, and no further HUD interference materialized, whether from genuine reconsideration or simple, pragmatic calculation. Daniel never learned, and did not particularly care. The vocational training center opened 3 months later, built on the same principle that had once saved Daniel's own life, that talent and determination, given even modest opportunity, could overcome circumstances designed to crush them entirely. Old Renick, frail but insistent, served as the center's first instructor, teaching a new generation of Mos Espas children the same trade that had once pulled a grieving orphan boy back from the edge of despair. Daniel funded scholarships for the settlement's most vulnerable children, orphans, refugees, the sons and daughters of families still climbing out of generations of debt bondage, ensuring that no child would face the particular cruelty of watching others attend school while they labored in someone else's fields. His cousins, meanwhile, found their diminished standing in the settlement increasingly difficult to bear. Trevin attempted, twice, to leverage the family connection for preferential treatment within Daniel's growing local operations, and twice was quietly, firmly refused, not out of cruelty. Daniel insisted to Corinne Vess when she questioned the decision, but out of the same principle that governed every hiring choice the foundation made. Positions went to those who needed them most and had earned them through genuine skill, not inherited entitlement. It was Renick, in the end, who convinced Daniel to extend one final act of grace. Hatred is heavy to carry, the old droidsmith told him, during one of their evening conversations in the half-finished training center. You've built something remarkable, boy. Don't let old grief poison it. Daniel considered this for several days before summoning Trevin and the rest of his father's cousins to a private meeting, not to punish them further, and not to embrace them as family, but to offer a final, deliberate act of separation from the past. Modest employment within the Foundation's infrastructure projects, contingent on fair labor and no special privilege, alongside a formal, public acknowledgement that the inheritance, seized from him years earlier, would never be reclaimed or repaid. I'm not offering this because I've forgotten, Daniel told them, his voice steady and free of the old bitterness that had once threatened to define him. I'm offering it because holding on to what you owe me would cost me more than it costs you. Take the work if you want it. Earn your place here like everyone else does. That's the only inheritance I have left to give you. They accepted, quietly, without the performative gratitude Trevin had once attempted. It was, perhaps, the closest thing to genuine humility Daniel had ever witnessed from them. The Vocational Training Center, within a year of its opening, had already produced its first graduates, young technicians and engineers, drawn from Mos Espas' most vulnerable families, trained in the same trade that had once pulled Daniel back from the edge of despair, now finding employment not just within Renick Fabrication's local operations, but across the wider network of independent traders and Republic contractors that Daniel's reputation had cultivated. Over 8 years of careful, principled growth, old Renick did not live to see the training center's second graduating class. He died quietly in his sleep during the settlement's cool season, in a small but comfortable dwelling Daniel had insisted on providing him years earlier, a modest kindness the old droidsmith had accepted only after considerable, characteristically stubborn resistance. Daniel funded a memorial at the center's entrance, a simple plaque bearing Renick's name and a single line the old man had once spoken to him. unknowingly shaping the philosophy that would eventually define an empire. Everything since has been you teaching yourself. The settlement itself transformed, gradually but unmistakably over the following years. The debt bondage arrangements that had once trapped families in generational servitude largely disappeared from Mos Espa, driven out not by Republic law, which had never meaningfully reached this corner of the Outer Rim, but by the simple economic reality that Daniel's foundation and growing local operations offered legitimate, dignified employment that HUD-affiliated moneylenders could no longer compete against. Children who might once have labored in borrowed fields instead attended the settlement's rebuilt school, funded entirely by the Rinnick Foundation, wearing uniforms that Daniel had specifically ensured were made by local tailors rather than imported at greater expense. The Clone Wars, meanwhile, ground on across the wider galaxy, its ultimate resolution still uncertain, its costs still mounting across 1,000 contested worlds. Daniel continued supplying Republic logistics vessels, alongside independent civilian traders, his company's careful neutrality regarding the wars, larger political currents allowing Rinnick fabrication to grow steadily. Even as more entangled interests suffered the war's volatile fortunes, he had built something he understood by his 10th year of quiet, deliberate success that was designed to outlast any single conflict, a philosophy of fairness and opportunity given industrial form, spreading gradually across the sectors his company touched. When settlement elders, years after his return, asked Daniel why he had chosen forgiveness over the vengeance his wealth and influence could easily have purchased, his answer remained consistent with the words he'd first spoken to Wold Rinnick in a rented storage unit on Corellia a lifetime ago. The pain I carried could have become bitterness, he told them. Instead, I let it become purpose. That's the only difference between what I survived and what I built. Mos Espa, once known across the Outer Rim only as another forgotten desert settlement, indistinguishable from 100 others, became known instead for the training center that drew apprentices from neighboring systems, for the foundation that had quietly dismantled one of Hutt territories' oldest exploitative practices, and for the boy who had once slept in a storage hut, hauling water beneath twin suns, before returning to rebuild everything that had been taken from him, not through conquest, but through the same stubborn, quiet determination that had first taught a grieving child to fix a broken astromech droid. The Force, if it noticed at all, offered no dramatic sign of its approval, no Jedi vision, no prophetic whisper carried on the wind. Perhaps some victories didn't require the Force's blessing. Perhaps they only required one person's refusal to let cruelty have the final word. May the Force be with you.